Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're tackling some pretty big concepts. The kind that have been keeping philosophers up at night for centuries.
That's right. We're talking about freedom, equality, justice, all those big ideas that shape societies and spark endless debate.
And we're not just throwing these terms around, we've actually got excerpts from some foundational political theory texts to guide us.
We'll be drawing on the wisdom of some of the greatest thinkers in history to unpack what these concepts really mean, how they connect, and most importantly, how they're relevant to your life.
Because let's be real, these aren't just abstract ideas, they have real-world implications for how we live, work, and interact with each other. So, are you ready to dive in?
Absolutely. Let's start with a big one, freedom.
Freedom seems like a pretty straightforward concept, right? Being able to do what you want without anyone telling you what to do.
Well, it turns out it's not quite that simple. One of the key insights from political theory is that there are actually different types of freedom.
Different types. Okay, now you've got my attention.
So we have what's called negative liberty, which is basically about being free from interference.
Free from interference. So like freedom of speech, freedom of religion,
Hmm,
nobody stopping you from expressing your beliefs or practicing your faith.
exactly. It's about having your basic rights protected, setting boundaries so you can live your life without intrusion. But then there's another type of freedom called positive liberty.
Positive liberty. What's that all about?
Positive liberty is more about having the actual capacity to act freely.
The capacity. So it's not enough to just not be prevented from doing something. You also need the means to actually make it happen.
Exactly. Think about it like this. You might be legally allowed to do something, say, start your own business. But if you don't have access to education, capital, or a supportive network, is that freedom really meaningful?
I see what you mean. It's one thing to have rights on paper, but if you don't have the resources or opportunities to exercise those rights, it's kind of like having a car but no gas.
Precisely. And one example the source material uses to illustrate this is dress codes.
Dress codes. I never would have thought of that as a freedom issue.
It's interesting, right? Because on the surface, any kind of dress code might seem like a restriction on your freedom to wear what you want. But some argue that in certain contexts, dress codes can actually enhance freedom.
Okay, now you're really making me think. How so?
Well, take school uniforms, for instance. They might seem limiting at first glance, but some people argue they can actually level the playing field,
Yeah.
Reduce pressure to conform to certain trends or worry about having the right clothes.
So it's about removing a potential source of anxiety or distraction so students can focus on other things like learning.
Right. And by creating a more equal environment, it might actually free up mental energy and give students a greater sense of agency.
That's a really interesting way to look at it. It's not always as simple as freedom versus rules. Sometimes a little bit of structure can actually create more freedom in the long run, depending on the context.
Exactly. And that nuanced perspective is what we're aiming for in this deep dive, because the world is rarely black and white. It's about understanding the complexities and trade-offs inherent in these big ideas.
And speaking of complex ideas, let's move on to another big one, equality.
Equality, a concept that's often invoked but rarely fully understood. And one that's particularly relevant here in India, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. I mean, just look around. The gap between the haves and have-nots can feel enormous at times. And one of the articles we have actually cites some pretty startling statistics about income inequality on the ground here.
It's a complex issue with deep historical roots. But before we even get into solutions, one of the sources encourages us to think about what we even mean by equality in the first place.
Good point. It's easy to throw that word around without really unpacking what it means.
Exactly. And one key distinction the text makes is between natural inequality and social inequality.
So, are some people simply born with advantages, or are those advantages largely a product of the systems and structures we've created? Nature versus nurture on a societal scale.
Exactly. Because it's one thing to acknowledge that people have different talents and abilities. That's just part of being human. But it's another thing entirely to look at the ways in which historical discrimination, access to resources, and unequal opportunities continue to shape outcomes today.
Right, because talent might be distributed somewhat randomly, but opportunity certainly isn't.
And this leads us to another key distinction within the equality debate. Equality of opportunity versus equality of outcome.
Okay, break that one down for me.
So, are we striving for a world where everyone starts the race at the same starting line, even if that means some people will naturally finish ahead of others? Or are we aiming for a world where everyone crosses the finish line at the same time, even if it requires some kind of intervention or redistribution of resources?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's one that plays out in all sorts of policy debates, from education to healthcare to taxation.
Absolutely. And one really interesting example the source material uses to illustrate this tension is the reservation system here in India,
Reservations, that's a topic that always gets people talking, to say the least.
to say the least. It's a policy designed to address historical injustices and create a more level playing field by reserving a certain percentage of seats in education and government jobs for members of historically disadvantaged groups.
And it's something people have very strong opinions about on both sides of the issue.
Absolutely. Supporters of the reservation system argue that it's essential for creating a more just and equitable society, ensuring that groups who were systematically excluded in the past have a fair shot at opportunities today.
Right. It's about acknowledging that equality of opportunity doesn't magically materialize just because we declare it. Sometimes you need to address the root causes of inequality, which might mean implementing policies that specifically benefit those who have been historically marginalized.
Precisely. But of course, there are also valid criticisms of the reservation system.
Yeah, some people argue that it can lead to reverse discrimination, where individuals from more privileged backgrounds are disadvantaged, even if they themselves haven't personally discriminated against anyone.
Exactly. They argue that meritocracy should be the guiding principle, and that any system that gives preferential treatment based on group identity rather than individual merit is inherently unfair.
It's a classic dilemma. How do you balance the ideals of fairness and equality when trying to correct for past injustices? It's messy, it's complicated, and there are no easy answers.
Which is exactly why it's so important to understand the nuances of the debate.
Well said. And that's what this deep dive is all about, equipping you with the knowledge and the different perspective to engage in these complex conversations in a thoughtful and informed way.
Because at the end of the day, understanding these concepts isn't just an intellectual exercise. It shapes how we interact with the world and how we advocate for change.
So true. It's about bridging the gap between theory and practice, between these big abstract ideas and the concrete realities of our lives.
And speaking of bridging gaps, I think it's time we move on to another concept that's closely related to both freedom and equality: justice.
Justice. Now, there's a word that gets thrown around a lot, but what does it actually mean to live in a just society? What should we be striving for?
That's a great question, and it's one we'll explore right after a quick break. So where were we? Ah, yes, justice. It's a concept that often gets reduced to courts and punishments.
Right, like justice is served when someone gets arrested and thrown in jail, but the sources we're looking at today suggest that justice is about something much bigger than that.
Absolutely. It's about fairness on a much broader scale.
Hmm.
It's about how we distribute things in society. And I'm not just talking about burdens like taxes or military service.
Right, it's also about who gets access to the good stuff: opportunities, resources, recognition, even basic necessities.
Exactly. And to grapple with what constitutes a just distribution, the source material lays out some key principles of justice. One that might seem obvious at first is equal treatment.
Equal treatment under the law, everyone's treated the same, no special favors. Sounds fair enough.
It does, doesn't it? But here's where it gets interesting. Sometimes treating everyone exactly the same isn't actually just.
Okay, now you've lost me. How could treating people differently be considered more just? That seems counterintuitive.
Let me give you an example. Think about accommodations for people with disabilities. If everyone has to take the same standardized test, for example, that might seem equal on the surface. But what about a student who needs extra time due to a learning disability? Or someone who needs a sign language interpreter to access the material?
Ah, I see where you're going with this. In that case, treating everyone the same would actually put those students at a disadvantage.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that true equality sometimes requires us to take individual needs and circumstances into account. Providing accommodations can actually level the playing field, making the competition fairer in the long run.
So it's not about treating everyone the same, it's about treating them fairly, which might mean taking different approaches depending on the situation.
That's a great way to put it. It's about recognizing that people have different starting points in life, and that true justice might require us to take those differences into account.
It reminds me of that old adage, treat equals equally and unequals unequally. But even that can feel tricky to navigate in practice. Where do you draw the line? Who decides who gets what accommodations?
You're right, it's a delicate balance, and there are no easy answers. But that's where having these frameworks for thinking about justice can be so helpful. They give us a starting point for having these important conversations. And speaking of frameworks, another principle the text highlights is proportionality.
Proportionality. Remind me what that one's all about.
This one gets at the relationship between effort and reward. Should people always be rewarded solely based on how hard they work, or are there other factors to consider?
Okay, that's a tough one. I mean, we all like to think that hard work should be rewarded, right? But the reality is life isn't always fair. People don't start the race from the same starting line.
Exactly. Some folks are born with advantages, whether it's wealth, social connections, or even just good genes, while others face all sorts of obstacles and disadvantages that have nothing to do with how hard they work.
So if someone's struggling to make ends meet, working multiple jobs just to put food on the table, should we really expect them to pull themselves up by their bootstraps? In the same way as someone who was born into a wealthy family and had all the opportunities in the world handed to them on a silver platter.
Right, and that's where things get philosophically interesting. One of the sources we're looking at today actually discusses this very dilemma. It talks about John Rawls and his famous veil of ignorance thought experiment.
Oh, I've heard of this. It's the one where you imagine yourself designing a society from scratch, but you don't know what your place in that society will be. You could be born rich or poor, healthy or sick, with all sorts of advantages or disadvantages.
Exactly. And Rawls argues that under this veil of ignorance, people would naturally design a more just society.
Because they wouldn't want to risk ending up on the short end of the stick. If you don't know what hand you're going to be dealt, you're more likely to create a system that's fair for everyone, even the least advantaged.
Precisely. It's a powerful thought experiment that encourages us to think about justice from a less self-interested perspective. It challenges us to put ourselves in other people's shoes and consider what a truly just and equitable society would look like.
It's a good reminder that we're all in this together and that creating a better world requires us to think beyond our own individual needs and desires. Okay, we've covered freedom, equality, justice, and I'm already feeling like my brain is doing backflips. Are you ready to move on to the next big idea?
Bring it on. We're just getting started. Let's talk about nationalism.
Nationalism now, there's a loaded word. It's a force that has shaped the destinies of nations, for better or for worse. And it's something we're seeing play out all over the world today, with both inspiring displays of patriotism and, unfortunately, troubling surges of xenophobia and intolerance.
Absolutely. It's a double-edged sword, that's for sure. And one of the sources we're looking at today really digs into that duality. It tries to get at the heart of what nationalism is, why it can be such a powerful force, and why it so often leads to conflict.
It's a question that's been on my mind a lot lately. What is it about this idea of belonging to a nation that can be so unifying and inspiring on the one hand, yet so divisive and destructive on the other?
It's a fascinating question. And one of the things this source points out is that nationalism is about more than just being born in a certain place or sharing a common language. It's about a shared history, a shared culture, often even a shared sense of destiny.
It's like this invisible thread that connects people across generations, a sense of belonging to something larger than themselves, a story that gives meaning and purpose to their individual lives.
Yeah, exactly. And that sense of shared identity can inspire incredible acts of courage, selflessness, and solidarity. Think about the ways in which people come together in times of crisis, natural disasters, wars, even just a global pandemic.
Right, it's like this primal instinct to band together with those we perceive as our own, to protect our tribe, our community, our nation.
Precisely. But as you pointed out earlier, this instinct can be manipulated, it can be distorted to serve less noble purposes.
Yeah, and that's where things can get dangerous. Because if nationalism is about defining who's in and who's out, then it can easily be used to justify discrimination, prejudice, even violence against those who are perceived as different or as a threat to the nation.
Exactly. And one of the sources actually uses a very specific historical example to illustrate this tension. The Basque separatist movement in Spain. Have you heard of this?
I have. It's a region in northern Spain with its own distinct language and culture. And there's been a long-standing movement for independence from Spain.
Right. And it highlights a key tension within nationalism.
Yeah.
What happens when a group within a nation feels like their identity isn't being respected or represented within the larger national narrative? What are the limits of national unity, and when does the desire for self-determination, the right to govern oneself, trump the idea of maintaining a unified state?
It's a question that's been at the heart of countless conflicts throughout history, and it's one that we're still grappling with today.
Absolutely. And it speaks to the complex relationship between national identity, individual rights, and the very idea of what constitutes a nation. It's a lot to unpack.
It is, and it makes you realize that nationalism isn't this monolithic thing. It means different things to different people, and it can manifest in very different ways depending on the context.
Exactly. It can be a force for good or a force for evil. It all depends on how it's wielded and who's doing the wielding.
Which makes me think about another concept that's closely related to nationalism, and that's secularism.
Ah, secularism, the separation of church and state. It's a concept that's often misunderstood, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. I used to think I had a pretty good grasp on it, but the more I learn, the more I realize how much nuance there is to it.
Right. And one of the sources we're looking at today does a fantastic job of teasing out those nuances. It emphasizes that secularism isn't about eliminating religion from public life altogether. It's about creating a system where all religions, or no religion at all, are treated equally under the law.
So it's not about suppressing religion, it's about preventing any one religion from having a privileged position or imposing its beliefs on others.
Precisely. It's about creating a space where people of different faiths, or no faith at all, can coexist peacefully and participate fully in society without fear of discrimination or persecution.
And that feels especially important in a country like India, which is home to so many different religions and belief systems.
Absolutely. And in fact, the source actually goes on to compare and contrast different models of secularism. It highlights the French model, which emphasizes strict neutrality and the absence of religious symbols in public spaces.
Right, like the ban on headscarves in French schools, that was really controversial example of this strict separation of religion and state.
Exactly. And then it contrasts that with the Indian model, which takes a more accommodative approach, recognizing and respecting the country's diverse religious landscape.
That makes sense given our history. A more rigid form of secularism might not work so well in a context where religion is so deeply intertwined with culture and identity.
Right, which just goes to show that even these seemingly universal principles, like secularism, need to be interpreted and applied thoughtfully, taking into account the specific historical, cultural, and social contexts of different societies.
It's a good reminder that there's rarely a one-size-fits-all approach to these big, complex issues.
Absolutely. And speaking of big, complex issues, I think it's time we tackled the big one. Peace.
Peace, it's something we all long for, especially in a world that often feels so full of conflict and division. But what does it actually mean to live in a state of peace? Is it just about the absence of war?
That's a great question. And one of the sources we're looking at today challenges us to go beyond that simplistic definition. It introduces this really thought-provoking concept called structural violence.
Structural violence, I've never heard that term before. What does it mean?
It's basically the idea that violence isn't always physical. It can be embedded in the very structures of society, in systems and institutions that perpetuate inequality, discrimination, and oppression.
So things like poverty, lack of access to healthcare, systemic racism, gender inequality, these could all be considered forms of violence, even if they don't involve guns or bombs.
Exactly, because they cause real harm, real suffering, even if it's less visible or dramatic than physical violence. Structural violence is about recognizing that true peace requires more than just the absence of war. It requires creating a just and equitable society where everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
Wow, that's a powerful way to think about it. It's not just about stopping wars, it's about creating a world where everyone feels safe, respected, and valued.
Precisely. And that requires us to look beyond the symptoms of conflict and address the root causes, the systemic injustices and inequalities that create the conditions for violence to flourish in the first place.
It's like that old saying, you can't have peace without justice.
Exactly. And speaking of justice, remember how we talked about the principle of proportionality earlier? Well, that comes into play here too, because one of the questions the source raises is, can violence ever be justified in the pursuit of peace?
That's a tough one. It feels wrong to condone violence in any form, but at the same time, I can see how there might be situations where it feels necessary to use force to stop a greater evil.
It's a moral dilemma that philosophers have been grappling with for centuries. And the source doesn't shy away from those complexities. It actually uses some pretty harrowing historical examples to illustrate just how difficult it can be to draw a line in the sand.
Like the example of the Khmer Rouge regime in Cambodia, a revolutionary movement that came to power promising peace and equality, but ended up committing horrific acts of violence and genocide in the name of creating a utopian society.
Exactly. It's a chilling reminder that even with the best of intentions, the path to peace can be fraught with danger, and that the means we use to achieve our goals matter just as much as the ends themselves.
So if violence often begets more violence, what are the alternatives? How do we break the cycle?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's one that we'll explore further in our next and final part of this deep dive into these monumental concepts. It's pretty amazing when you think about it, how much ground we've covered just by taking a closer look at these, what, like 6 words?
I know, right? Freedom, equality, justice, nationalism, secularism, peace. They seem so simple on the surface, but each one opens up these endless layers of complexity.
It's like we've been given a whole new vocabulary for making sense of the world. Or maybe even more than that, it's like these concepts give us a new lens through which to see the world, to understand the forces that shape our lives and the choices we make.
Totally. And what's been really eye-opening for me is how interconnected all these concepts are. It's not enough to just think about them in isolation because they're constantly bumping up against each other, influencing each other, shaping each other in the real world.
It's like that old saying, everything's connected, man. But it's true. And one of the most important takeaways from this deep dive, I think, is that we can't really talk about freedom without talking about equality, or justice without talking about nationalism, or peace without talking about secularism.
Yeah, and remember how we talked about the different types of freedom, negative and positive liberty?
Oh yeah, the whole freedom from versus freedom to thing. Classic.
Right. So if true freedom isn't just about not being prevented from doing something, but also about having the actual capacity to act freely, to pursue your goals and live a meaningful life, well, that gets a lot more complicated when you factor in things like economic inequality, systemic racism, gender discrimination, all those systems of oppression that limit people's opportunities and choices right from the start.
Totally. It's like you can't just talk about freedom in a vacuum. You have to look at the context, the circumstances, the power dynamics that shape people's lives.
Exactly. Because if someone's basic needs aren't being met, if they're struggling just to survive, how much freedom do they really have? How much agency can they exercise?
Exactly. It's like that old line, the freedom to sleep under a bridge isn't really freedom if you have nowhere else to go.
Right. So any conversation about freedom has to include a conversation about justice, about equality, about creating a society where everyone has a genuine shot at living a good life.
You know what else struck me during this deep dive? The whole nationalism thing. It's such a powerful force, and it can be used for good or for evil.
Totally. I mean, on the one hand, it can be beautiful people coming together to support each other, to celebrate their shared culture, to fight for a common cause.
Right, like think about those incredible images of people coming together after natural disasters, complete strangers helping each other rebuild, offering food and shelter, finding strength in their shared humanity.
Exactly. But then on the other hand, you have examples of nationalism being used to justify all sorts of horrible things: war, genocide, oppression.
Because it's so easy to slip from a healthy sense of we're in this together to a dangerous us versus them mentality, where anyone who doesn't fit into your narrow definition of the nation is seen as a threat.
And that's where things can get really scary really fast, especially when you have leaders who are willing to exploit those fears and prejudices for their own gain.
It's like a fire.
Yeah.
It can be a source of warmth and light, but it can also burn everything to the ground if it's not carefully controlled. And that's where secularism comes in, I think.
Oh, yeah, secularism. That's another one of those concepts that's often misunderstood, but it's so important for creating a just and peaceful society.
Absolutely. Because if nationalism is about binding people together based on shared identity, secularism is about creating a space where people can coexist peacefully even if they have different beliefs, different faith, different ways of seeing the world.
It's about recognizing that everyone has the right to their own beliefs as long as those beliefs don't infringe on the rights of others.
Exactly. And that's not always easy. I mean, people feel really strongly about their beliefs, and it can be tempting to want to impose those beliefs on others, especially if you think you have a monopoly on the truth.
For sure. But that's where tolerance and respect come in. And that's where a strong commitment to secularism can make all the difference.
It's about finding a way to live together peacefully, even when we disagree, which, let's be real, is something we could all use a little more of these days.
Amen to that. So, as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm wondering, what's the takeaway for our listeners? What do we want them to walk away with?
I think the biggest takeaway is that these big ideas, freedom, equality, justice, nationalism, secularism, peace, They're not just abstract concepts that we talk about in philosophy class.
Right. They're not just words on a page.
They're living, breathing ideas that shape our world in profound ways. And they're constantly evolving, constantly being reinterpreted and reapplied in new and often unexpected ways.
So what you're saying is the conversation never really ends.
Exactly. And that's a good thing, because it means we're still wrestling with these big questions, still trying to figure out how to create a more just and peaceful world. And that's something worth striving for, don't you think?
Absolutely. So keep those brains buzzing, folks, and never stop questioning, never stop exploring, and never stop fighting for the world you want to see.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.